in order to destroy an entire people. And the Olympics, I think, is going to be a very interesting issue. I think we're going to be debating this for many months to come. I don't know what the outcome will be, but the Beijing Olympics are going to be a major issue for American and international debate for months to come.
John, if I can follow up, what do you think the policy that the U.S. should hold on the Beijing Olympics? Are we in or are we out?
One of the worst things about an Olympics boycott is you dash the dreams and hopes and lives of thousands, if not tens of thousands of American athletes and their families and those of our allied countries, really who have no responsibility and no dog in this fight, so to speak. I think there are going to be a number of interesting, creative ways to engage in punitive actions against Beijing for cultural genocide against the Uyghurs, for its efforts to swallow up whole Taiwan in the next several years, and a whole host of other issues that you raised, including Hong Kong, that may include corporate and official boycotts of China. Now, the corporate, of course, you can't enforce in a free market economy like the United States, but I think you will see a near zero participation on an official level by the Biden administration and perhaps state and local governments, and to look to see what kind of strong signals can be sent to censure China and to make it very clear the world isn't simply sitting by while it commits genocide. But the problem is China is so powerful and so secretive in its operations. If we think about it realistically, there's not much the world can do if the Chinese Communist Party is determined to destroy an entire subculture. Really not much we can do. But we can send very strong diplomatic signals, and I think that will be the creative debate in the next 9 months.
Do you think, John, that a more aggressive use, like in the Trump administration, of sanctions, Trump used them in order to strengthen his hand around trade disputes, but here in human rights and other policy decisions that the Biden administration has to exert, should they be more aggressive with sanctions as it relates to things like these human rights violations?
Credibly, I don't think that's going to be the hand that the Biden administration will want to play. I think they'll be looking to reserve not only sanctions, but perhaps arms sales, possibly other types of tariffs and the like, and really to start to target the individuals around Xi Jinping to put the pressure on Xi to relax many of China's aggressive policies. But I think we're going to be looking at the major strategic issues, Rick, like Taiwan, Japan and China's attack on Japanese Senkaku Islands, on Hong Kong, on the border skirmishes with India, and of course its efforts to swallow up the international waters of the South China Sea and convert that into a Chinese lake in contravention of international law and freedom of navigation worldwide. So those are going to be the strategic issues which will be looking to engage in the most determined opposition to China as opposed to human rights, which is really not much the world can do because
John, if I can interrupt you,
the Chinese government has a complete lockdown.
Thank you so much for your participation in today's panel. You've made it great. Jeannie, I guess this puts on hold our plans to be in Beijing for the Olympics.
That's
and,
right.
I want to thank
The world's financial decision makers connect on the Bloomberg Terminal, sharing ideas, negotiating trades, and forming an influential network that helps power global markets. Isn't it time you join them? Bloomberg.com/professional.
Managers who seize change to launch new strategies, add distribution channels, or exploit new technology to re-engineer the investor experience are often rewarded. However, in an industry paralyzed with complexity, few act with agility or decisively. Few run their businesses strategically. Yet the most competitive managers in the market know with the right partner and a flexible operating system, you can. Go boldly toward change with SEI Investment Manager Services.
Determination and operational strength are both essential factors for growth in asset management. I'm Steve Meyer, President and Head of SEI's Investment Manager Services Division. We know that disruptive forces create opportunities around the world. If you see potential in change, our industry specialists will maximize SEI's integrated platform of data and risk management, global investment operations, compliance support, and investor services to position your asset management business for success. Come grow with us.
With SEI Investment Manager Services, you lead the charge in a competitive marketplace. Learn more at seic.com/seize change.
It takes coordination to read the latest business news while spreading jam on toast.
Whoops.
Listening takes no effort at all.
It had a major beat on industrial free cash flow.
Bloomberg Daybreak.
President Biden is pushing up the timeline.
Karen Moscow and Nathan Hager.
We have a deal in the gambling industry.
Weekday mornings at 5 Eastern.
Officials have a warning for hedge fund managers.
On Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Business app, and BloombergRadio.com. Bloomberg, the world is listening.
For the Jewish Communal Fund, past President Noel Spiegel.
People often ask me why it's important to use JCF for their charitable giving. I tell them that JCF has a profound impact on our community. Thanks to the revenue generated from our funds, JCF makes an annual $2 million grant to UJA Federation of New York and makes grants from our endowment, the Special Gifts Fund. This year, we proudly granted more than $800,000 to support a kosher food pantry at Mid-Island YJCC, Jewish daycare at the Ed Alliance, a renovation at Camp Oakhurst, and an intergenerational Holocaust program at Ramaz. I'd like you to hear about our impact from a past Special Gifts Fund recipient.
Plaza Jewish Community Chapel is most grateful to JCF for supplying seed money to start the organization. Almost 10,000 families have relied on Plaza to provide an affordable yet dignified Jewish funeral.
Let JCF maximize your impact. Visit jcfny.org or call 212-752-8277.
Broadcasting 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is Bloomberg Radio. Now a global news update.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia for this Wednesday, April 14th here in Hong Kong, Tuesday, April 13th in New York. And coming up this hour,
U.S. stocks rise as investors bet inflation concerns won't be enough to slow stimulus measures.
Bitcoin rises to a new record ahead of a Coinbase IPO.
And we speak with Brazil's central bank president.
Dr. Fauci says the pause of the J&J vaccine should instill confidence and safety. Boris Johnson says health safety stopped UK surge. Hong Kong election, December 19th. I'm Ed Baxter with Global News.
Chelsea and Paris Saint-Germain both reached the semifinals of the Champions League. I'm Dan Schwartzman. I'll have that story and more coming up in Bloomberg Sports.
That's all straight ahead on Bloomberg Daybreak Asia. On Bloomberg 1130 New York, Bloomberg 99.1 Washington, D.C., Bloomberg 106.1 Boston, Bloomberg 960 San Francisco, Sirius XM 119, and around the world on BloombergRadio.com and via the Bloomberg Business app.
Hi, everybody. It is actually daybreak here in Hong Kong. I'm Brian Curtis.
And I'm Rashad Salam at the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia, presented by IBKR, the professional's gateway to the markets. The clients can enjoy lowest cost access for stocks, options, futures, forex, and fixed income from a single integrated account. Learn more at ibkr.com. Right, let's have a look at how things are shaping up for the Asian trading day. Let's get to Bloomberg's Doug Krisner. If I can open my mouth without changing feet, Doug, I think I'll just pass it over to you. Thanks.
Rish. Well, you know, we began the day with that figure on U.S. retail inflation, a little hotter than forecast, with CPI coming up by about 0.6% last month. But that essentially took a back seat to the much bigger news story of the day, the U.S. recommending a pause in using the Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine. A rare blood clot complication has been linked to the shot. And we should point out that this technology behind the J&J vaccine is very different than what's being used by Moderna and Pfizer, the so-called messenger RNA. Both of those stocks, by the way, were up today. But will the news on J&J impact confidence? That's the big question. Shares in many stay-at-home companies were in favor today. Travel, we had names like Carnival, Royal Caribbean Cruises, and even American Airlines moving lower today. We had the S&P 500 and the tech-heavy NASDAQ 100 each hitting record highs, although the Dow Industrial Average was lower. We also had weakness in the Russell 2000, so small caps hit a bit today with the Russell down about 0.2%. Not surprising to see a move lower in long-term interest rates. 10-year Treasury down more than 5 basis points here in New York, last quoted at 1.61%. That weighed on the financials. And as long as we're talking financials, let's talk Bitcoin. Now at 63,186, we're very near an all-time high as the market prepares for the listing of the crypto exchange Coinbase. Brian?
All right, Doug, thanks very much. As mentioned, we have Brazil's central bank president, Roberto Campos Neto, coming up for a discussion here on the program in the first hour. And we'll also be sitting down with Walter Todd, president and chief investment officer, and also managing director over at Greenwood Capital. He'll be with us live in a few moments to talk about what else might be already priced into markets. So you're saying what else from what? Well, I'm saying that perhaps inflation is already priced in. Hardly any reaction in the markets today. So we'll get to that in a moment. Let's take a closer look here at the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Usage of it has been put on pause for the time being, and the focus is now on immune reactions. Bloomberg's Riley Griffin tells us the side effects to vaccines from J&J and AstraZeneca are similar.
It seems very similar to blood clotting incidents that were seen with the AstraZeneca vaccine, which relies on a similar underlying technology called adenovirus platform. And here they're thinking it may be tied to an immune response after vaccination that leads to an activation of platelets and clotting. But again, they are investigating this in real time.
The syndrome in question is highly unusual, as heard there. It involves increased clotting along with low levels of platelets. The syndrome has only been seen at low levels. There have been 6 cases out of more than 6 million doses. Nonetheless, it does raise some significant concerns and restrictions on the use of these vaccines. Rish.
Right, well, we've got China's finance ministry considering moving its stake in the troubled China Huarong asset manager to a unit of China's sovereign wealth fund. The unit of the fund is Central Huijin Investment. Huijin has more experience resolving debt risks. We're being told it's a prime reason for the transfer. Now, the market's been worried about China Huarong's financial health. The company's dollar bonds tumbling to record lows this month. We're told that the proposed transfer wouldn't mean a change in the level of government backing for the company. The finance ministry aiming to complete a transfer in the next few months.
All right, the time here is 5 minutes past the hour. It is time for Global News. Well, as we just reported, the CDC and the FDA have put use of the J&J vaccine on pause here. Health officials saying that it should enhance confidence in safety, particularly over the longer term. Ed Baxter has Global News from the 960 Newsroom. Ed.
Yeah, very important over the longer term. You're right, Brian. Dr. Anthony Fauci says it should be a brief pause based on an abundance of caution.
This is a really rare event. If you look at what we know so far, there have been 6 out of the 6.85 million doses, which is less than 1 in a million.
And the White House Coronavirus Task Force head Jeffrey Zients says it should really be reassuring.
The FDA acting the way they did today shows that they are indeed the gold standard, and I think that should reassure the American public that they will be very diligent and conservative in how they approach the vaccines.
And Dr. Jeffrey Kahn at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School for Public Health says, surprising to know that it's AstraZeneca. It's the same thing that AstraZeneca is going through.
The J&J and the AstraZeneca vaccines are similar in the way that they're built. So again, it's not terribly surprising to see a very small number of cases of blood clotting in the J&J implementation so far.
And Dr. Kahn says this again should reassure the public of safety when it is available. And Dr. Fauci says it's all based on science.
The pause not only allows us to take a look at the cases and learn more, but it is also a signal out there to help the physicians.
So all Fauci, Zients, and President Biden have chimed in saying this will not slow the process of getting all Americans vaccinated. In fact, Pfizer says it's upping production now. Moderna has now announced as well new research that says after 6 months, over 90% efficacy remains. Hong Kong vaccine bookings have pretty much doubled after Chief Executive Carrie Lam promised some social distancing incentives for those fully vaccinated, a day after over 13,000 for Pfizer and another 3,300 appointments for Sinovac. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson putting some perspective today on the fight there. He says vaccination is very important, but
reduction in these numbers, in hospitalizations and in deaths and in infections, has not been achieved by the vaccination program. People don't, I think, appreciate that it's the lockdown
Yeah, he says people need to be very cautious not to cause another surge. Hong Kong's Legislative Council election now, the date officially set for December 19th. Carrie Lam making official what had been talked about a month ago. This is a bill to approve China's plan, she says, to organize public elections. She says it also contains rules to make it illegal to organize public activities that incite others not to vote. In San Francisco, I'm Ed Baxter. This is Bloomberg. Brian?
Yeah, thank you. 8 minutes past the hour. Let's get to Walter Todd, President, Chief Investment Officer, and Managing Director at Greenwood Capital. So, Walter, perhaps you heard me mention that the performance in the markets today kind of suggests that inflation is already priced in, because we've got a little bit of a hot number and the markets really didn't pay too much attention. Yields actually a little bit lower. But so if that's priced in, does it suggest that growth is already priced in too?
Yeah, well, good evening. Yeah, I think to a certain degree, in the short term, I think you could say that. I mean, it's tough to read the response today, given the J&J news in terms of how yields reacted. But I think it's safe to say that there's a lot of good news discounted in the market. I think as we start to get earnings tomorrow, you've had significant moves in the banks and financials into these earnings numbers. We've seen this the past two reporting seasons where they run hot into the numbers and then sell off after very good fundamental numbers, which we expect. So I think in the near term, it would be healthy for the market to kind of take a breather here. We're extended on a lot of different metrics. But I think the outlook for the year from a fundamental standpoint still remains very good, the J&J news, notwithstanding today.
And I guess, the banks are going to be the highlight of the forthcoming earnings season at the start, at least. We've got a whole welter of them reporting this week. What do you expect them to say? I mean, of course, there'll be people will be looking at how much what their forecasts are. And on top of that, there's been a clear outperformance of banks of late compared to nearly any other asset class.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you look at the past 6 months, they have trounced the broader market. J.P. Morgan up 70%. Bank of America up over 75. So I think in terms of the reporting, everything's going the right way for them. The yield curve steepening, M&A's rolling, trading should be good, loans are picking up. So to your point, you're going to have these huge kind of numbers that come out over the next couple of weeks. J.P. Morgan could be up 285% on an EPS basis year over year. These base effects are going to be kind of very confusing, but the important thing is going to be what do they see for the rest of the year? And do they see a continued outlook for growth as we head through the rest of 2021? And then looking out into 2022, it's a little bit harder to look out that far, but we're going to need to see that for these stocks to continue to work this year.
Yeah, I've got a slightly different take on it. The banks have been flat for the last month, as though they've kind of priced in, where they're at. But they're only 10% higher than where they were last February before they fell 50%, and that's a broad index. That's the XLF. So you're only 10% higher. The economy looks a lot stronger at the moment now coming out of this than it probably did last February, right? We don't have enough time to get into it just here, Walter, but we'll pick up on what we expect not only from the bank earnings, but also the rest of the earnings as they come. A lot this week. Walter Todd with Greenwood Capital is with us live here on the program. And we'll take a closer look at the markets with Doug Krisner coming up shortly. This is Bloomberg.
The world's financial decision makers connect on the Bloomberg terminal. The buy side and the sell side together, collaborating across markets and countries in real time, sharing ideas, negotiating trades, and forming an influential network of over 325,000 financial professionals that helps power global markets. Isn't it time you join them? Request a demo at bloomberg.com/professional.
Imagine being denied an apartment because of your religion, or your race, or because you have children, or a disability.
It's so wrong. Yes, but who has the power to stop this?
You do. Each of us has the power. The law is on your side. It's illegal for landlords to discriminate because of race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, or familial status. If you suspect that you have experienced housing discrimination, file a complaint with HUD immediately so we can investigate it. Fair housing housing is your right.
Use it.
To learn more, visit HUD.gov/fair housing. That's HUD.gov/fair housing. Or call 1-800-669-9777. 1-800-669-9777. A public service message from HUD in partnership with the National Fair Housing Alliance.
The following is a message from PGIM.
Welcome to Outsea in 60, Perspectives from PGIM Thought Leaders. Here's Lisa Davis, Impact Investing Portfolio Manager at PGIM Real Estate.
I think we used to believe in ESG circles that climate change was the great systemic risk to financial markets that we needed to find a way to account for, and the challenge was to connect the individual investments that we were making to addressing climate risk at a systemic level. I think the challenge now that I see is that inequality around the globe is an equally important systemic risk, often connected to climate risk, that we have to address in financial markets.
Hear more PGIM perspectives at pgim.com. That's PGIM.com. Partner with PGIM, the investment management business of Prudential. These statements are not intended to be investment advice and should not be used as the basis for any investment decision.
How are financial services firms managing in this new reality? Claire Santaniello, Managing Director at BNY Mellon's Pershing, explains.
If the current times have taught us anything, it's the critical role that technology plays in client relationships. Global conditions have created a business imperative for firms to digitally transform the way they meet client needs and the way they work. Pershing's industry-leading technology enables you to adapt to the evolving ways your clients want to do business, now and in the future, and can help you build an even stronger digital client experience in a simpler, smarter, and safer environment. We have worked with clients of every size to transform their business. Pershing gives you the foundation to stand on, plus our unique perspective, to help you run your business even during the most uncertain of times. We help you consider everything.
To learn more about how Pershing can help you transform your business, visit Pershing.com. Pershing LLC, member FINRA, NYSE, SIPC.
After listening to Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller,
extraordinary science coming out of the biotech and pharmaceutical industries.
You'll not only have new insights.
What are the numbers you think you can hit?
You'll be confident that what you've learned is accurate.
I'd love to get your thoughts on what's happening in Europe.
Bloomberg Markets.
Even you're bringing it into next year.
Weekday mornings at 10 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Business app, and BloombergRadio.com. Bloomberg, the world is listening.
Office sanitation is more important now than ever. Disinfectants alone won't do the job because they only work per application, exposing surfaces to recontamination. BioShield Matrix is a surface coating with an antimicrobial additive that continuously kills coronavirus and harmful pathogens to create a safe work environment. BioShield Matrix is non-toxic, easy to use, and will not stain or bleach your surfaces. One application for 90 days of proven protection. Do you have the Matrix? BioShieldMatrix.com.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia. It's a quarter past the hour now. Time for a check of sport from around the world. Here's Dan Schwartzman.
Thanks, Brian. Paris Saint-Germain reaches the semifinals of the Champions League after a 1-0 second-leg loss to Parc des Princes to Bayern Munich, but advanced 3-3 aggregate on away goals. PSG will next play the winner of Manchester City and Borussia Dortmund. Meanwhile, Chelsea advances as well with a 1-0 second-leg loss to Porto, a move on 2-1 aggregate with both legs taking place in Seville, Spain, due to COVID restrictions. Blues have reached the last four for the first time since 2014. Daniil Medvedev has withdrawn from the Monte Carlo Masters after testing positive for COVID-19. The world's number 2 ranked men's player has been placed in isolation and has been replaced in both the main draw and the doubles competition. The Arizona Cardinals signing former Pittsburgh Steelers running back James Conner to a 1-year contract. Last season, the 25-year-old rushed for 721 yards and 6 touchdowns and made the Pro Bowl back in 2018 after rushing for 973 yards and 12 touchdowns while catching 55 passes in just 13 games. Former Yankee starter James Paxton will miss the rest of the season for the Seattle Mariners with an elbow injury that will require surgery after pitching just an inning and a third on the season. The oft-injured 32-year-old returned to Seattle after spending the past 2 years in New York. Finally, the Denver Nuggets suffering a huge loss as star Jamal Murray is out indefinitely after tearing an ACL in his left knee in Monday's loss to the Golden State Warriors. The Nuggets were winners of 17 of their last 20 games before losing 2 in a row. I'm Dan Schwartzman. That's your Bloomberg World Sports Update.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
We're about an hour and 43 minutes now away from the opening in Tokyo, Sydney, and Seoul. We got a weaker dollar. Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index was down about 0.3% today. Let's take a look at what happened in the U.S. in terms of price action. Natalia Kunizevich is here. What did you see happening in markets today?
So it was all about Johnson & Johnson vaccine news today. The U.S. recommended taking a pause on using Johnson & Johnson vaccinations. And that was after a report linking vaccine to blood clots. And now it's all about confidence in vaccines, and some investors are rethinking the growth outlook. So long-term interest rates dropped today. 10-year treasuries were last quoted at 1.61%. Other bond proxies such as utilities, consumer staples, they were up. And again, we saw this strong correlation, lower yields, higher tech and higher stay-at-home stocks. So the news from J&J was bad, of course, for reopening stocks such as airlines, travel, hospitality. They were all down today. But even before today's news on J&J, reopening stocks have been losing momentum. So over the last month, the S&P 500 Value Index underperformed growth by more than 7%. Doug?
All right, let's get caught up on global news next. Ed Baxter's in the Bloomberg 960 newsroom in San Francisco. Eddie.
All right, my friend Douglas. China has joined South Korea and Taiwan in voicing displeasure with Japan's announcement to release water from the Daiichi into the Pacific. It says it reserves a right to take action. Dr. Anthony Fauci says the J&J vaccine pause should be temporary, should instill faith in the U.S. commitment to safe vaccines. The Biden administration says there will be enough supply to meet vaccination goals. Pfizer ups production to fill voids. Moderna says efficacy is above 90% in its vaccine still after 6 months. Hong Kong vaccine bookings have pretty much doubled after Chief Executive Carrie Lam promised to social distancing incentives for those fully vaccinated. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson says vaccinations are very important, but Britain pulled out of the surge, he says, by practicing good health procedures. Hong Kong's Legislative Council election now officially set for December 19th. U.S. White House today says, and calls between Presidents Biden and Putin. Mr. Biden warned the U.S. would act in defense of U.S. national interest. Iran is now vowing to ramp up its uranium enrichment programs. Tehran says for the first time to levels of 60% from 20. And U.S. climate envoy John Kerry will visit China this week to talk climate change and efforts to curb carbon emissions. In San Francisco, I'm Ed Baxter. This is Bloomberg. Rish.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Ed. Let's get back to our guest for the half hour, Walter Todd, President and Chief Investment Officer and Managing Director at Greenwood Capital. Walter, is there something out there that people are missing?
Well, if I could just go back real quick to what Brian was saying before the break around banks underperforming.
Okay, but why don't I get Brian to ask you that question again for our listeners?
Okay.
Right.
Well, no, it was just really just looking at the banks. I mean, they've adjusted somewhat, and given that they fell so dramatically last March, the place for that right now is only 10% above where they were back in February. So some might say that this is sort of a comfortable zone for them, Walter.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, it's true when you look back, they're not up much more than they were, before the pandemic. But from an earnings standpoint, they're actually not, if they hit their numbers projected for this year, they actually won't be back to the numbers from 2019. So it kind of makes sense to your point. I mean, kind of where they're trading. So my only point was just, given the run from kind of the vaccine news in November and the strong move, that they may take a while to digest, some of the good news is what I was pointing out. And then as far as, Rashad, as far as your message, what people are missing, I think in a little bit longer term, trying to look out to 2022, the concept of a kind of a fiscal cliff that could be coming in terms of lower spending and higher taxes, that could become a problem, later in the year as we start to, I know we're not focused on 2022 right now, but as we start to look ahead, that could be a challenge, for the market overall as we see that spending fall off and maybe taxes go up, given the proposals that we've had.
We saw a bounce in the stay-at-home stocks today, so that suggests to at least some investors that, this COVID-19 is going to be around for a while. You had Zoom that rose 6.6%, but even after that, it's still down 40% from its high back in October. So my question is, does that mean it's an opportunity to go back into some of these, or is it a sign that they're done? They're basically done because of COVID is going to run its course this year.
Yeah.
A survey said that among fund managers, they see inflation, a taper tantrum, and higher taxes as a bigger risk than COVID-19. Besides taxes, are you particularly worried about either of the other two, the taper tantrum or inflation?
Yeah, I think inflation. I guess I'm a little bit more concerned about it than the Federal Reserve seems to be. They seem to think it's a very temporary phenomenon, and I guess time will tell. But I think the imbalance between demand and supply right now across a variety of different industries could be longer lasting than people think. Lumber's up 80% on a year-to-date basis, up 40% in the past month. So inflation is a bit of a concern for us. And the other one you mentioned was taxes
and taper tantrum. Yeah,
the taper tantrum. I mean, if the Fed says what they follows through with what they're saying, that should not be an issue until well into next year, but we'll see. So I'm not as concerned about that, but I am more concerned on the inflation front.
But surely, ultimately here, inflation is going to be a good thing. I mean, Walter, they wouldn't represent growth. It would represent, as long as it doesn't get out of control, naturally.
Yeah. Well, I've never understood this target of why they want to see 2% inflation. I mean, personally, I don't like paying more for stuff. But, again, I understand the Fed favors inflation versus deflation. And I do think if it's kind of happening for the right reasons, that it is a positive. But again, these supply chain disruptions that we're seeing that are flowing through in the prices paid index component in manufacturing and in services, those are problematic. And if they don't get rectified, in a short period of time, they could continue to put upward pressure on prices. And I just think from a standpoint of certain commodities, certain markets like housing, I mean, you're getting housing levels that, up 11, 12% on a year-over-year basis. From a price standpoint, you're pricing a lot of people out of the market there. So, I mean, it can get, beyond a comfortable level.
So you're pretty confident. You're talking about growth, sort of, up in the, I guess, high single digits, something like that.
Yep.
And would you say that it was the best we've seen in 30-odd years or something like that? Let's take a look at the portfolio that you're working with. You mentioned energy and industrials and chemicals and those types of things. What would this sort of mix be, and what would you lean to the most aggressively?
Yeah. So we do try to have a balanced portfolio. We are overweight some of those cyclical areas like industrials, like energy. Of course, being overweight energy versus the S&P still means you don't have a ton of weight there because the market weight's only about 2.8%. But overweight materials, At the same time, we do want to have some of those secular growth areas as well, exposure like in information technology. So we've got some software and semis in that area, and healthcare, which has been a challenging sector really for the year and really for the past 6 to 9 months, but it's a more longer-term secular grower. So we want to have a balance there, but on the margin, we're leaning more reopening, if you will, more cyclical in our positioning in that balanced portfolio.
Are you looking abroad?
Yeah, so we do have, yes, we do own some ADRs in our domestic large cap portfolio, for example, and we also have an international ETF portfolio, which is well diversified across a lot of different geographies. And I do think, given the underperformance of international, I know this has been a broken record kind of conversation, but the past decade it's underperformed so dramatically that the valuation disparity between ex-U.S. and U.S. is fairly dramatic. So I do think you do want to keep some exposure to overseas markets, both developed and emerging.
All right, Walter, good stuff. Thank you very much for joining us. Always fun to talk to you. Walter Todd, President, Chief Investment Officer, and Managing Director at Greenwood Capital. Well, the time is coming up to the bottom of the hour. We've got a big interview with Brazil's central bank governor, Roberto Campos Neto, coming up. Let me just give you the latest on what we're seeing in the markets here this morning. Looking at Nikkei futures, 29,840. So that's essentially flat here at the moment. Compares with the close yesterday of 29,751. So we may say a little pullback today. And Hang Seng Index futures are up about 1/3%. Well, we look more closely at Brazil's economy coming up, the path of interest rates. Inflation has been on the rise in Brazil. Bloomberg's Sherian sits down with Brazil's central bank governor, Roberto Campos Neto, and this is an exclusive conversation on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
Welcome back to Daybreak Asia. I'm Sherian in New York. We want to welcome Bloomberg Television viewers and radio listeners all over the world. We have continued to see accelerating inflation pressuring policymakers in Brazil, which raised rates by the most in a decade in March. The central bank has signaled more rate hikes to come, despite the economy still reeling from the fallout of rising infections. Joining me now is the president of Brazil's central bank, Roberto Campos Neto. President Campos Neto, great to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Let's get started with the conversation on your rate path, because, of course, you have signaled another hike that could take the Selic to around 3.5% next month. But swap rates right now pricing in a rate above 6% by year end. What do you make of this?
No, I think it's important to understand what is the market pricing. So I think when you look at the interest rate curve, part of what you see in the long end is referring to a fiscal premium. So Brazil has had a very big fiscal expansion that reflects into an uncertainty that gets priced in the long end of the curve, and we see that. But for us, the important thing doing policy is to look at inflation. I mean, we are inflation targeters, so we need to look at inflation. And in that front, looking at inflation is where we are trying to be more transparent and give all the explanations to what we think the path is for interest rates.
But economists are also projecting a rate above 5%. Will the bank need to be more aggressive come year end?
Well, we don't forecast where rates are going to be. What we are basically saying is we understand there is a process of inflation going higher. A lot of this process has to do with components that are not structural, that are temporary. We had an increase in commodities that's not only affecting inflation in Brazil, but it's affecting inflation in other places. You have the food items that are very important for Brazil with energy, and also the food items gives a contamination to ethanol, which also increases prices in the industry. And on the top of that, we had a depreciation. So commodity prices in reais in the local currency have increased a lot. So we understand that this process is taking place. We understand that this process had some contamination into the core inflation numbers, and we explicitly saying what we are seeing and why we think it's important to do the move that we did in policy. We did 75 basis. We indicated another 75 basis, and we keep vigilant on how this process is developing, looking at all the process of contamination from current inflation.
Will another 75 basis points help when it comes to those inflationary pressures?
Well, we look at what is the horizon that we need to act. So for now, the horizon, the most relevant horizon is 2022. So we look at what needs to be done in terms of adjustment of inflation, recognizing that part of it is temporary, and we think towards the end of the year the inflation is going to go back lower, and we think we are adjusting rates so that we have our target. And by the way, when you look at the output gap, we also see a convergence in 2022. So those things are aligned.
But you're not planning to take the neutral rate, go back to the neutral rate this year, right? You're still planning to leave some monetary stimulus for 2021.
Yes, no, the question in every meeting, the first question is, do we need stimulative conditions? And the answer is yes, we do. We're still facing a pandemic, we're still facing a country that has many problems, so we do think stimulative conditions. Then the question is, how stimulative they need to be? Remember that when we placed interest rates at 2, we were envisioning a scenario that never happened. People were talking about negative growth in the magnitude of 8-9%. Some people were saying inflation was going to be as low as 1.5%. None of these things materialized. So it's not adjusting inflation for what we think it should be compared to the neutral rate. It's recognizing that the interest rate that we have now was set up for conditions that never materialize, and that we need to move rates but still be on stimulative grounds. And that's why we mentioned the partial normalization process.
But the concern right now is that all of those inflationary pressures that you mentioned, you are considering those as temporary, but we are already seeing second round effects. How do you deal with that? And when do you decide to deal with that?
Well, when you look at, for example, from one Copom meeting to the other, our projection for 2021, it was 3.4, and now it's 5. When you decompose, when you look at inside the number, most of the things are explained by commodity prices and the depreciation and the impact that this has on other chains. So we do recognize that there is some contamination. We think that there is no structural contamination. We think there is most of the effect is temporary. But, nothing is written on stone. We're going to look and see how this develops. We just had a recent number of inflation, and it was a bit better than expected. And we saw that the core inflation was actually a bit lower than expected. So we need to watch. So remembering that we don't target the very short end. There is a horizon for what we do to take place, and we're looking at 2022 more and more.
And by year end 2021, where do you expect inflation to be?
Our number is 5%. When we moved to 5% right during the Copom meeting, the consensus was a little bit lower than 5%, and I think the consensus now is moving higher as people are looking at how the process develops.
Exactly. So is there a concern that perhaps then inflation expectations for 2022 will also become higher?
That was actually one of the reasons that we mentioned why we're doing a move that was higher than what the market expected. We mentioned that we understand that 2021 is higher, but 2021 in the horizon only stays for a while because we start moving the window to 2022. But we mentioned that there is always a risk that the short-term inflation starts contaminating the long end, and that's why we thought we needed to move more than what the market expects, because we think moving more has greater efficiency, and at the end you need to do less.
If we see more pressure on the real because of budget concerns, because of political noise, what will that mean for the central bank?
The real, when you look at the last couple of weeks, of months, they have been stable. It's been a bit volatile, but it's been stable. For us, the important thing is not the real. We think we work under a system of floating exchange rate. The important thing is how the real contaminates the inflation channel through the short-term inflation and through its expectations. And we are watching, we are vigilant on that, and we will act if needed. But, as we mentioned, unless something extraordinary happens, it's under our scenario, exactly the conditions that we're seeing now, and we don't see anything different than 75 basis, which is what we indicated, unless something different happens. But nothing is written on stone. I mean, we could face very different conditions from now on. We don't think this is the most likely scenario, but we do have alternative scenarios, and we have been very transparent about them.
When you say act when needed, what exactly does that mean? What level would that the real be at?
It's difficult to say because it's not about the real. It's about how the real influences the expected inflation in the current inflation in the short term, and how it influences the expected inflation that.
Okay, so you've said that the pass-through has declined, right, from the real, but with the real close to 6, could you say that it's now increasing again?
No, what we said was that the persistence of the real at a level that was with a high level of devaluation, the persistence has indicated to us that the high persistence have contaminated more prices. But again, when you look at the real and you look at commodity prices in the short term seem to have stabilized a little bit. But again, we don't work on supposition, on supposing things. We need to see how that develops. Remembering that our time horizon is 2022 now.
Right. Are you, in the meantime, though, considering any additional instruments to stabilize the currency markets?
No, we are not considering. In the currency market, no. Again, the currency market in the currency market, we think FX is floating. So we do intervene when we think there is a dysfunction in the way that FX is trading. But we don't target a level. We don't have a level in mind, and we don't target FX because it has influence on inflation or on inflation expectations. We take it as given, and we only act on FX when we think the market is dysfunctional. We think the floating regime has served us well, and we think it's very important to communicate that we believe in the principle of separation.
No regular dollar sales from the reserves then?
No, we've never done regular dollar sales. What we've done is when there is a dysfunction in the market, we try to see what kind of dysfunction that is and how much it would take to fix that. We think about a volume that we should use in the intervention, and we slice this volume in a couple of days.
Let's talk about fiscal risk, because you've been very vocal about the fiscal risks around, also about the impact on monetary policy, the spending cap rule that could be breached. We have these talks ongoing. What could force you to take another look at your economic outlook, at your monetary policy outlook?
Again, it's the same as the question that you just asked about the FX. I mean, we don't have a target for fiscal. We do believe that the fiscal is imposing a premium on the curve, and this premium contaminates expectation that ends up contaminating inflation. We think it's very important to pass a message of fiscal discipline. We don't think we are in any kind of fiscal dominance effect, but we do think that because we had a very large expenditure facing the pandemic, it's important to pass a message that we had an extraordinary year that needed extraordinary measures, but we are going to go back into converging the fiscal path. That's what we have been expressing, remembering that central bank doesn't do fiscal policy, so we take it as given.
Let's take a look at the global macro environment as well, because, of course, central banks in developed economies have pledged low interest rates for longer. But how much time do you expect Brazil and other developing nations to have before big central banks start turning the tide?
I think we have a process in place in which all this new stimulus and everything that's happening is repricing the probability of inflation in advanced economies, and that has an impact in emerging market countries. It doesn't mean that you're going to see a surge in inflation in developing advanced markets. What it does mean is when you look at markets, they are seeing that things are starting to happen in the same window of time, which is you have more stimulus, you have the vaccination, which enable the countries to reopen the economy, and at the same time, people question more and more the ability to do an organized exit strategy. So if you take these three elements, what the market is doing is repricing inflation in the advanced economies, and you can see that looking at the break-even in the US and some other countries. And what that does is has an impact on emerging market countries because commodities are rising. With commodities rising, what you do have is an impact on inflation in emerging market countries. Remember that contrary to the past, now you have commodities rising without the currencies of emerging market countries appreciating. So that feeds into an effect. And what we're seeing is that you have this food inflation element in most of emerging market countries that starts to contaminate the inflation numbers.
Are you worried about a surge of outflows if we see a surprise, not perhaps tightening, but perceived tightening in advanced economies?
No, when we look at outflows, and you need to characterize what that is. When you look at fixed income, Brazil has at some point in time a participation in foreigners of the public debt of more than 22%. It's now down to 7%. So right now the participation of foreigners in the fixed income curve in Brazil is not that big. We've seen large outflows. I think we have stabilized. When you look at the equity world, I think it has a different dynamics because it's looking at growth potential. It's more correlated with external indexes. So no, we don't think that is a huge problem in terms of external outflow, but we do think that we need to do our homework to get the inflows back. Remembering also that when you look at the outflows and the inflows, there is a new element, which is on the way back of the outflows that we had in March of last year, a lot of it is going to China. So China is absorbing more and more the inflows to emerging market countries, and that put us in a different situation than we were in the past.
We have seen some negative news when it comes to vaccinations, whether it's problems with J&J.
Not responsible for vaccination, but what we do is we need to understand how is the reopening of the economy is going to happen. So basically the exercise that we do is very simple. We look at all the doses that have been purchased and there is a compromise to deliver. We imagine that all these doses that the government has been purchased, we applied into people, and then we do curves taking all the age groups, going from the older to the younger, seeing by June how much people we are going to have vaccinated and what is the break-even in terms of the age group. And when we look at that, actually, and on the top of that, we designed two curves. One of the first dose in terms of the impact on hospitalization and deaths, and also we look at this second dose. And when you look at those curves with the numbers that we have, we think that we have all the conditions to start reopening the economy in the second semester. So on the contrary, when we look at the doses that we have and what we are able to do in terms of vaccination, we become more optimistic about the second semester.
President Campos Neto, finally, we are seeing a lot of political noise in Brazil. How often do you speak to Minister Guedes, to President Bolsonaro? How close is the coordination, especially when it comes to market signaling?
No, I think the coordination between the Minister of Economics and the central bank in times of crisis need to be a very good coordination, and we are very coordinated. Remember that one thing that we've learned from the crisis in 2008, that you need monetary policy and fiscal policy to be very coordinated. So everything was very coordinated, but we divided into two different parts. If you think all the measures that are taken to face the pandemic, basically what you do have is you have direct transfers, you have avoiding taxes or delaying taxes, and those are the Ministry of Finance, because those involve fiscal. Then you have monetary policy and credit measures, liquidity plus capital, injection of liquidity plus capital, and that is the central bank. And the place that we work together is on the credit measures. We design some of the credit policies together, but remembering that whenever it involves a subsidy or a transfer from the Treasury, the central bank doesn't get involved. We don't want to mix monetary policy with fiscal policy. That's very important for us.
President Campos Neto, please join us again soon. Roberto Campos Neto, Brazil Central Bank President. Thank you.
All right, and thank you, Sherry On at Bloomberg Television. This is Daybreak Asia. Brian, I'm sorry to interrupt. I was going to hit us with a data check, but you had a couple of thoughts?
Well, no, I just was going to wrap up on some of the key points, but I think it was pretty obvious there, really. I mean, he's talked about the extraordinary fiscal expansion that Brazil has had to do, and that's part and parcel of the inflation story. He said that basically with inflation moving higher, a lot of that came from higher commodity prices, food items, along with energy generally, and they would be vigilant. But he sort of hinted that inflation for Brazil is not necessarily structural, and he thinks that it will return to lower levels. Not considering measures on the currency, the real, and not expecting to sell dollars from the reserve. And said a big part of this story, too, is inflation being repriced in some of the developed economies. And just at the end there, he made an interesting comment, Doug, which I think we're all very aware of, and that is that China is absorbing a lot more emerging market output than ever before, and this creates a pretty interesting dynamic for emerging market countries and dealing with inflation. So I just wanted to mention a couple of those key points, and then get to you for a look at markets.
Well, the big news today here in the States was the U.S. recommending a pause in using the Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine. There is a rare blood clot complication that's been linked to the shot, and it depressed shares of J&J today, and also dealt the market with the kind of a curveball notion that maybe we have to reevaluate the pace of the recovery. Many stay-at-home stocks were in favor today, and then on the other hand, we had travel shares, names like Carnival, Royal Caribbean Cruises, and even American Airlines moving to the downside. That said, the S&P 500 and the tech-heavy NASDAQ 100 did reach record highs today. We did have some weakness in the Dow Industrial Average. Russell 2000 today down about 0.2%. Now, with a reevaluation on the growth outlook, we had a drop in long-term interest rates. A 10-year Treasury down more than or nearly 5 basis points today at 1.61%, and that decline weighed on financial shares. We had the S&P Financials Index down about 2% today. Bitcoin right now 63,223. We are very near an all-time high. The mood in cryptos a little bullish today, right before the crypto exchange Coinbase Global goes public. All right, we are caught up on market action. Let's get global news next. And Ed Baxter in the Bloomberg 960 newsroom in San Francisco. Eddie.
All right, thank you, Douglas. You mentioned J&J. Dr. Anthony Fauci says the vaccine pause of J&J should be temporary, should instill faith in the U.S. commitment to safe vaccines. The Biden administration says there will be enough supply to meet vaccination goals. Pfizer has upped its production to fill any voids. Moderna says its efficacy rating is above 90% still after 6 months. This new research. Hong Kong vaccine bookings have pretty much doubled after Chief Executive Carrie Lam promised some social distancing incentives for those fully vaccinated. 17 New York Democrats now have told House Speaker Nancy Pelosi that the economic/infrastructure bill will not receive their support unless the SALT deductions are fully restored. Now, that covers things like property tax, mortgage interest, DMV deductions that the Trump administration ripped away. China has joined South Korea and Taiwan in voicing displeasure with Japan's announcement to release water from Daiichi into the Pacific, says reserves the right to take action. Australia's Health Minister Greg Hunt has refused to guarantee Australia's borders will open even if the whole country has been vaccinated against COVID. And while it struggles to get supply, the Washington Post is reporting Australia's opted against purchasing any J&J vaccine now. In San Francisco, I'm Ed Baxter. This is Bloomberg. Brian.
Well, thanks very much, Ed. The time here is 9 minutes before the top of the hour. And just a further note on the Fukushima water plan. The BBC has an interesting report about the IAEA saying that they will assist. They said that they will work with Japan before, during, and after the plan to replace some 1 million tons of contaminated water. And also here from the South China Morning Post, just to add to your coverage, Ed, on what's happening here with COVID-19, particularly in Hong Kong. Officials had to come out and apologize as 24 residents received a different COVID vaccine to the one that they booked. And this is since the bookings began back in February. A government spokesman revealed yesterday an additional 19 cases to the 5 that were previously reported. The administration says in some cases this was the fault of people going to the wrong center and it being just an unfortunate mistake. It also said that it has now reviewed procedures at vaccination centers, and some new measures have been implemented to avoid these mistakes in future. All right, that's just a look at the media here in this hour, and we'll do it again next hour. Rashad.
All right, well, joining us now is Michelle Cortez, Bloomberg healthcare reporter, discussing the J&J pausing of the use of its COVID vaccine shot in the U.S. Michelle, welcome to the show. This is a little bit of left field news here, very similar to AstraZeneca as well. Tell us about the mechanics.
So what's happening here is women between the ages of 18 and 48, 6 of them developed these very rare blood clots in the brain within a week to 2 weeks of getting the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Now, they do believe that this might be related to the mechanism of action because it is a shot that works similarly to the AstraZeneca vaccine. And, of course, it's the same side effects that they're seeing. The numbers, though, unbelievably small, 6 out of almost 7 million people who have gotten this vaccine. So the risk is low, but it's real. The concern is that the way that doctors would normally treat this condition could actually make it worse. So they're saying, hey, let's take a pause, let's regroup, let's figure out how we should handle these rare conditions when they come up, and then we'll reconsider whether to go forward.
Is it fair to say that, this definitely hurts the rollout of vaccines in the short term, but that this added transparency and the careful nature of the approach by the regulators suggests that longer term it will add to confidence? Because the last thing in the world people want to do is to doubt the government, to doubt the regulators. So it's a short-term hit, but better in the long run. Is that kind of the argument here in the debate?
Well, you certainly hope that that's going to be the situation, but you have to wonder how people are going to respond to this. I don't know that people think really that deeply about the details. Honestly, when we're talking about these numbers, they are vanishingly small. But all people are really going to be hearing about is there's a potentially deadly side effect with some of these vaccines. So I am concerned about the way that people are hearing this news and moving forward. Of course, the regulators were in a terrible position because when you're talking about a vaccine, you're talking about protecting people from a virus that they might not have ever encountered. And of course, these are young women, presumably healthy, who otherwise might have been just fine if they had gotten infected with the virus. So here you are, unintentionally harming people who might have had no problem at all in order to protect a larger group of people from the virus itself. So regulators didn't really have much of a choice when it came to this, I think. Once they found out that this side effect was really popping up in numbers that makes it seem to be a real issue, they have to take that seriously because obviously if you're not, then that is going to create even more damage down the line.
Now, Michelle, how do the risks compare with the risks of other non-COVID vaccines or with causes of blood clots coming from birth control medication, for instance?
Right. Well, so that's exactly the point. That's a very common thing that women are much more likely to develop a blood clot from being on birth control pills, even more likely to develop a blood clot when they're actually having a child. Of course, what we're talking about here is a very specific type of clot that forms in the brain, and that is very rare, higher in this particular respect. But you ask a really great question, which is they are watching this vaccine roll out so closely and so precisely in Europe and in the U.S. Would we have even noticed a risk like this if it had come in any other circumstance? We're talking about 7 million vaccines having been given in just a few weeks. And of course, people are on the lookout for anything related to that. Now, if you had gotten, the flu shot at some point last year, anytime between October and March, and then, a few weeks later you had a blood clot, maybe your doctor would have said blood clots happen because they do, and would have never tied it back to that flu shot. So I do think there might be an element of we're finding what we're looking for, and it makes you wonder what we're not looking for.
How similar are the levels of infection here, or these occurrences of blood clots, and how does it compare to the AstraZeneca issues?
Right. Well, both of these numbers, again, I feel like I'm a broken record here saying vanishingly small, right? Like the number is like 0.000058% is your risk of developing one of these clots. So when you're looking at both the AstraZeneca and the J&J clot risks, they're both a tiny fraction of a percentage, very, very small risks, indistinguishable from each other, almost indistinguishable from, what we would happen normally, except for now we do know that those numbers are rising to something that they need to pay attention to. The
Michelle?
concern, of course, is the vaccine itself.
Very, very quickly, how should we move ahead with this? Should it be limited by age, gender, etc.?
Well, they're limiting by gender and by age. J&J came out just a few minutes ago saying that they're halting their rollout in Europe, stopping their clinical trials while they're looking at it. So no one's going to be getting it for a while.
All right, Michelle, great stuff. Thank you very much. Michelle Cortez, Bloomberg healthcare reporter, with us live here. Coming up to the top of the hour, we'll take a look at all the top stories again, including more on this J&J vaccine, how it's been pulled. We'll look at the markets and the top business stories. Doug Krisner will rejoin us, and I'll take a look at markets. This is Bloomberg.
If knowledge is power, the Bloomberg Terminal is your power up, connecting you to real-time financial data, market-moving news, powerful analytics, and an influential network of financial decision makers around the world. Share ideas, negotiate trades, and gain the insight you need to make more informed decisions. See how the terminal can take your workflow to the next level at Bloomberg.com/professional.
This is the Bloomberg Green Business Report. A research paper published in Biological Conservation warns that 20% of the world's land-based animals would be at risk if the Earth's temperature rises 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That is currently predicted to happen by 2100. The researchers say 2% of land-based creatures would be at risk if the temperature increase is limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the aim of the Paris Climate Accord. But without world governments coming together to achieve the goal, nearly half of endemic marine species and 84% of native mountain species would be in a fight for survival. The United Nations estimates about 1 million species are currently at risk of extinction around the world, many within a matter of decades. It is hoped the new report will serve as a reminder of the plight faced by so many of the world's creatures. Its release follows another recent study that revealed a general lack of awareness about the extent of the threat. Jeff Bellinger, Bloomberg Radio.
Are you interested in a challenging and exciting career? One where you can be part of solving complex challenges across industries and geographies? Bloomberg's ever-expanding technology, data, news, and media services foster innovation, empower clients, and offer nearly limitless opportunities for career growth. Visit Bloomberg.com/careers today to view our current job opportunities. Bloomberg LP is an equal opportunity employer. The address once again is Bloomberg.com/careers. Broadcasting 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is Bloomberg Radio.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia for this Wednesday, April 14th in Hong Kong, Tuesday, April 13th in New York. Coming up this hour,
U.S. stocks rise as investors bet inflation concerns won't be enough to slow stimulus measures.
Bitcoin climbs to a fresh record ahead of a Coinbase listing.
And Singapore's Grab Holdings is going public in the U.S.
Dr. Fauci says the pause on the J&J vaccine should instill confidence and safety. Boris Johnson says health safety stopped UK surge. Hong Kong election, December 19th. I'm Ed Baxter with Global News.
Paris Saint-Germain and Chelsea both reached the semifinals of the Champions League after losses. I'm Dan Schwartzman. I'll have that story and more coming up in Bloomberg Sports.
That's all straight ahead on Bloomberg Daybreak Asia. On Bloomberg 1130 New York, Bloomberg 99.1 Washington, D.C., Bloomberg 106.1 Boston, Bloomberg 960 San Francisco, Sirius XM 119, and around the world on BloombergRadio.com and via the Bloomberg Business app.
Welcome to the program. It is hour 2, and we are an hour away from the open of cash markets in Tokyo and in Seoul. If you're joining us from the region, good morning. I'm Doug Krisner at the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in New York.
And I'm Paul Allen in Sydney, where it's 9:01 on Wednesday morning, an hour away from the open here in Sydney as well. Futures pointing a little higher at the moment. For a closer look at what to expect, let's get over to Brian Curtis in Hong Kong. Brian?
Yes, Paul, thanks very much. Yeah, it looks like modest gains for Asia today, in that sort of range of 1/3% or so for a couple of key markets. Nikkei futures at 29,845 would suggest that at the open. And we also have Hang Seng Index futures up about 1/3%. China futures up about, call it 1/5%. Earlier, U.S. stocks rose to record highs, and bond yields actually fell. Investors really taking in stride the higher than forecast rise in inflation. It seems like the data just wasn't really strong enough to put investors off of what they think will be more economic stimulus measures coming from the Fed. In other words, it won't set the Fed back. The S&P 500, again, at an all-time high. There was another potential setback. That's the pause on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. We'll bring you some of the details on that in a moment. The NASDAQ 100 also set a record high. It's been on a very strong run here in the last 2 weeks for the mega-cap tech stocks. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, though, finished slightly in the red, dropping 68 points, down about 0.2%. U.S. consumer prices jumped 2.6% in the 12 months through March, and that from the Labor Department. And again, just didn't really have a huge impact. We had a Bank of America survey saying that fund managers are more concerned about inflation, a taper tantrum, and higher taxes. They think those are bigger risks now than COVID-19. The yield on the 10-year, 1.61%, WTI $60.57, and Bitcoin up there around 63,250 with a big gain today in the latest action. Doug, to you.
Well, Brian, as you mentioned, the usage of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine now on pause. The focus is now on immune reactions. Bloomberg's Riley Griffin telling us earlier the side effects to the vaccines, not only from J&J, but AstraZeneca, well, they're similar.
It seems very similar to blood clotting incidents that were seen with the AstraZeneca vaccine, which relies on a similar underlying technology called adenovirus platform. And here they're thinking it may be tied to an immune response after vaccination that leads to an activation of platelets and clotting. But again, they are investigating this in real time.
That said, the syndrome in question is highly unusual. It involves increased clotting, as Riley mentioned, along with low platelet levels. The syndrome has only been seen in very few cases. There are 6 cases here in the States among more than 7 million people who have received the J&J shot. Nonetheless, it does raise the possibility of significant restrictions possibly being placed on the use of these vaccines worldwide. Paul?
China's finance ministry is said to be considering transferring its stake in the troubled asset manager China Orang to a unit of China's sovereign wealth fund. Bloomberg's Rosalind Chin has more from Hong Kong.
The unit of the fund is Central Huijian Investment. Huijian has more experience resolving debt risks, and we're told that's a prime reason for the transfer. The market's been worried about China Huarong's financial health. The company's dollar bonds have been tumbling to record lows this month. We're told the proposed transfer would not mean a change in the level of government backing for the company. The finance ministry aims to complete a transfer in the next few months. In Hong Kong, I'm Rosalind Chin, Bloomberg Daybreak Asia.
Coming up here on 5 minutes past the hour. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine story. Health officials here in the U.S. putting it on pause, saying it should enhance confidence in the safety of the vaccine. Ed Baxter covering it all from the Bloomberg 960 newsroom in San Francisco. Eddie?
Yeah, exactly right, Douglas. It's been gone to surmise that the pause was called to get that confidence level up. Dr. Anthony Fauci says it should be a brief pause based on an abundance of caution.
This is a really rare event. If you look at what we know so far, there have been 6 out of the 6.85 million doses, which is less than 1 in a million.
Now, I was just reading a report coming in from Jared Polis, who is the governor of Colorado. He said on the governor's call this morning that he was insured by these doctors because he says Colorado needs it, that it would be a matter of days and they'd be back up using it. The White House Coronavirus Task Force head, Jeffrey Zients, says it should really be reassuring in the long run.
The FDA acting the way they did today shows that they are indeed the gold standard, and I think that should reassure the American public that they will be very diligent and conservative in how they approach the vaccines.
And Dr. Jeffrey Kahn at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School for Public Health says it is surprising to know AstraZeneca is going through the same thing, and now this, because they're similar.
The J&J and the AstraZeneca vaccines are similar in the way that they're built. So again, it's not terribly surprising to see a very small number of cases of blood clotting in the J&J implementation so far.
And Dr. Kahn again says should reassure the public of safety. And Dr. Fauci says this is all based on science.
The pause not only allows us to take a look at the cases and learn more, but it is also a signal out there to help the physicians.
Fauci, Zients, President Biden say they will not slow the process of getting all Americans vaccinated. In fact, Pfizer says it's upping production now. And Moderna, interestingly today, has announced a new research that says after 6 months, over 90% efficacy remains. Hong Kong vaccine bookings have pretty much doubled after Chief Executive Carrie Lam promised some social distancing incentives for those fully vaccinated. A day over day, 13,000 for Pfizer, another 3,000 for Sinovac. UK, Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, putting some perspective today on the fight. He says vaccination is very important, but
reduction in these numbers, in hospitalizations and in deaths and in infections, has not been achieved by the vaccination program. People don't, I think, appreciate that it's the lockdown.
He says people need to be very cautious and not to cause other people to get the infection. Hong Kong's Legislative Council election is now officially set for December 19th. Carrie Lam making official what had been talked about for months now. It is a bill to approve China's plan to organize public elections, she says. It also contains rules to make it illegal to organize public activities that incite others not to vote. In San Francisco, I'm Ed Baxter. This is Bloomberg. All right, Doug.
All right, Ed, thank you. Let's get to our guest for the half hour. Stefan Hofer is Asia Chief Investment Strategist at LGT Bank to take a look at what's happening in markets. Stefan, thank you so much for being with us. Curious to get your reaction on what happened today with the J&J vaccine, and more to the point, whether or not this has the ability to hold back confidence in the population, and maybe we might see kind of a drop in the willingness of people to get the vaccines.
Well, there's always that risk, but I think, the general trend has been, and really when we look at the sort of the larger economies, actually an acceleration in vaccination rates, and also a decline in the 7-day moving average of infections and so on. So the general trend to reach herd immunity is really what the market is looking at, and I would say that's broadly intact.
Yeah, that is the question of the day on the Bloomberg terminal, in fact, is how will vaccine delays affect the stock rally? How do you see it affecting it?
I think it's been surprisingly resilient so far. I mean, this is not the first time that we've had news like this. I think markets are taking them largely in stride. And then, of course, we have a cacophony, really, of very impressive macro numbers that tend to overwhelm the vaccine sort of setbacks, whether you look at global trade, industrial production, retail sales. I mean, the list really goes on. So the general mood, I think, in markets remains quite positive.
Brian highlighted a survey from Bank of America looking at what fund managers are seeing across world markets now. The survey concludes that the risk of higher inflation, maybe a taper tantrum, or even higher taxes, those are bigger risks than COVID-19 in and of itself. I mean, do you see things in a similar way?
Yeah, that's very interesting. It almost suggests that people have sort of moved on from COVID-19, which I think would be maybe going a step too far. But in the near term, we have this reflationary bump in the inflation numbers that we're looking at. The big expectation from markets is that it is transitory. It's very important that happens. There is a small outside risk that we have a structural increase in inflation, but I would emphasize really that's not our baseline view, but that is the risk that fund managers seem to be keenly aware of.
So how are you hedging against that risk?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, if you have a moderately inflationary environment, between 1% to 3%, something of that nature, it's actually, historically speaking, not bad for equities. And so one thing that you can do right now is look at, for example, materials, which is a very popular sector to hedge against rising prices. And frankly, also the steepening of the yield curve obviously speaks very well for financials.
With the exception of today's move in the bond market, where we had a drop in the 10-year yield of about not quite 5 basis points, 161, as we get set for trading in Tokyo. Tomorrow, the banks are going to kick off first quarter earnings season, Stefan. We're going to hear from, as you know, JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, and Wells Fargo. What are the risks here? And 1 week from today, Procter & Gamble will become the first household and personal care company to report. Goldman had an interesting call today. They say that overall, this group faces compounding headwinds heading into first quarter earnings. Maybe we can talk about that notion, the trap of household and personal care stocks in the current environment. Our guest, Stefan Hofer of LGT Bank, here on Daybreak Asia, will update markets and global news in a moment. This is Bloomberg.
If knowledge is power, the Bloomberg Terminal is your power up, connecting you to the real-time financial news, data, and analytics that can take your workflow to the next level. Power up at Bloomberg.com/professional.
Following is a message from PGIM.
Welcome to Outsea in 60, Perspectives from PGIM Thought Leaders. Here's Lisa Davis, Impact Investing Portfolio Manager at PGIM Real Estate.
I think we used to believe in ESG circles that climate change was the great systemic risk to financial markets that we needed to find a way to account for. And the challenge was to connect the individual investments that we were making to addressing climate risk at a systemic level. I think the challenge now that I see is that inequality around the globe is an equally important systemic risk, often connected to climate risk, that we have to address in financial markets.
Hear more PGIM perspectives at PGIM.com. That's PGIM.com. Partner with PGIM, the investment management business of Prudential. These statements are not intended to be investment advice and should not be used as the basis for any investment decision.
NJIT, New Jersey Institute of Technology, makes innovation happen. NJIT faculty mentored Christoph Camacho when he was a student, helping him co-found a startup and patent a device that uses drone technology for reforestation and to collect valuable data for land management.
I founded Paratrees back in 2016, taking what I learned from my research at NJIT and migrating it to a startup. Our technology is to really enhance land management operations, so we work very closely with land management companies. So we have a drone that performs precision reforestation, and we do storm damage assessment, having access to drones that can collect data so it's much faster. And what is more important, we help them drive management decisions. NJIT has been there every step of the way, going full force with my company.
NJIT, New Jersey Institute of Technology. Learn more at njit.edu.
Asset managers who seize change to launch new strategies, add distribution channels, or exploit new technology to re-engineer the investor experience are often rewarded. However, in an industry paralyzed with complexity, few act with agility or decisively. Few run their businesses strategically, yet the most competitive managers in the market know with the right partner and a flexible operating system, you can. Go boldly toward change with SEI Investment Manager Services.
I'm Steve Meyer, president of SEI's Investment Manager Services. At SEI, we understand the emerging forces that will define success for asset managers and what firms will need to compete tomorrow. That's why we continually optimize SEI's global operating platform. If your business requires greater agility, our advanced technology, integrated best-in-class systems, and multi-asset expertise can be your catalyst for business transformation.
With SEI Investment Manager Services, you lead the charge in a competitive marketplace. Learn more at seic.com/seize change.
Start your market day with Bloomberg Surveillance.
The bond market, it's a really interesting soup.
Tom Keene, Jonathan Ferro, and Lisa Abramowitz.
Isn't your base case the worst case scenario for most?
Who says finance can't be fun?
Who's in the zoo, guys? Which one of us?
I think it's pretty clear who's in the zoo.
Bloomberg Surveillance. Must listen, must watch.
I think they made a great decision separating us both.
Weekday mornings at 7 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television.
The private equity space is more competitive than ever before. Successful transactions require quality, speed, and efficiency. Closing a deal is just the beginning. That's why Witham is dedicated to the entire life cycle of your investment. Private equity investors trust Witham to bring thoughtful financial insights, tax structuring, integration, and cyber risk mitigation to strengthen value creation. Experience the Witham way. Visit witham.com/PE. Witham.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia. It's a quarter past the hour now. Time for a check of sport from around the world. Here's Dan Schwartzman.
Thanks, Brian. Daniil Medvedev has withdrawn from the Monte Carlo Masters after testing positive for COVID-19. The world's number 2 ranked men's player has been placed in isolation and has been replaced in both the main draw and the doubles competition. Paris Saint-Germain reaching the semifinals of the Champions League after a 1-0 second leg loss at Parc des Princes to Bayern Munich, but advanced 3-all aggregate on away goals. PSG will next play the winner of Borussia Dortmund and Manchester City. Meanwhile, Chelsea advances as well with a 1-0 second leg loss to Porto, but move on 2-1 aggregate with both legs taking place in Seville, Spain due to COVID restrictions. The Blues have reached the last 4 for the first time since 2014. Sky Germany reporting that Tottenham will make a big push for Bayern Munich center back Jerome Boateng, with the 32-year-old becoming a free transfer this summer after Munich said they would not renew the Germany international's contract. Sources say both Chelsea and Arsenal will also look to sign Boateng, who has spent the past 10 years with the Bundesliga Giants. Former Yankee starter James Paxton will miss the rest of the season for the Seattle Mariners with an elbow injury that will require surgery after pitching just an inning and a third on the season. The oft-injured 32-year-old returned to Seattle after spending the past 2 years in New York. Finally, the Arizona Cardinals signing former Pittsburgh Steelers running back James Conner to a 1-year contract. Last season, the 25-year-old rushed for 721 yards and 6 touchdowns, but made the Pro Bowl back in 2018. I'm Dan Schwartzman. That's your Bloomberg World Sports Update.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hi, everybody. 17 minutes past the hour. We update markets for you every quarter hour here on the show. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia. Well, looking at some modest gains today, it seems like around 1/3% or so for a number of markets. That's what we see in terms of Australian futures, Nikkei futures, similar margin. Hang Seng futures also with a gain of 95 points. That's about 1/3%. FTSE China A50s with gains of about 0.2%. Earlier, U.S. stocks rose to record highs. Bond yields fell for the day. Consumer prices rose more than expected last month in the United States. But investors speculated that the acceleration was really not fast enough to trouble the Fed. U.S. consumer prices jumping 2.6% in the 12 months through March. Compared to February, the CPI rose 0.6%. The S&P 500 up 13 points to 4141, an all-time high. We had a setback, which was the pause on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, but investors also seem to take that in stride. The drop in yields did weigh on bank shares, and we had JP Morgan down 1.2%. Now, the NASDAQ sets a reference price of $250 for the direct listing of Coinbase Global. That will start trading tomorrow via direct listing. And also, Grab Holdings is going public through a merger with a blank check company. Grab is Southeast Asia's most valuable startup. And right now, we've got dollar yen trading at 109.01. And yield on the 10-year, 1.61%. Let's get a news update now. Ed Baxter is in San Francisco. Ed?
All right. Thank you very much, Brian. China has joined South Korea and Taiwan in voicing displeasure with Japan's announcement to release water from the Daiichi into the Pacific, says it reserves a right to take action. Australia's Health Minister Greg Hunt has refused to guarantee Australia's borders will open even if the whole country has been vaccinated against COVID. The Washington Post is reporting Australia has opted against purchasing the J&J vaccine. At the same time, it's struggling to keep up with supply expectations. Dr. Anthony Fauci says the J&J vaccine pause should be temporary, should instill faith in the U.S. commitment to safe vaccines. The Biden administration says there will be enough supply to meet vaccination goals. Pfizer ups production to fill any voids. Moderna says efficacy is above 90% in its vaccines after 6 months. Hong Kong vaccine bookings have pretty much doubled after Chief Executive Carrie Lam promised some social distancing incentives for those fully vaccinated. In San Francisco, I'm Ed Baxter. This is Bloomberg. Paul.
All right, thanks very much, Ed. Our guest for the half hour is Stefan Hofer. He is Asia Chief Investment Strategist at MYLGT Bank. And Stefan, as we have been discussing, earnings getting underway in just a few hours, actually. JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs to report. The consensus seems to be for a pretty decent set of numbers. What are you anticipating?
Yeah, for the financials, that certainly would be the case. But I would say that broadly speaking, over the course of the year, actually the U.S. is likely to underperform earnings growth relative to Europe and Japan, just because those markets are far more cyclical and are taking a greater advantage of the global reopening process. So it's not a bad earnings season that we're looking for the United States, but I think relatively speaking, you're going to see greater profits growth elsewhere.
Is the market maybe ripe for a little disappointment, do you think? Are we priced to perfection?
Yeah, that's sort of the million-dollar question. As long as the inflation story doesn't get out of control, as long as the overall trend in the reopening process, given progress on COVID-19, can stay intact, then I would say on balance, I think the market can continue to grow higher. But the inflation story will become more important as the months progress, and that could lead to some volatility for sure.
Do you get at all concerned about the amount of debt that's being accumulated in the fiscal response to the virus?
Yeah, that's also, of course, very important. And here, setting aside the next, say, 3 months or so, on a 12-month horizon, that's why we're calling for a moderately weaker dollar, just because, the fiscal expansion in the United States is really quite phenomenal in peacetime, and that has to be reflected somewhere, and probably it's going to be on the currency side.
It's interesting. Today I was reading a note from J.P. Morgan Chase. It kind of concluded that global markets may have reached an inflection point. Value shares are set, in the view of J.P. Morgan, to outperform growth stocks for a significant period. Do you think that is likely, given everything you just laid out?
I think that's very interesting. Certainly, I wouldn't say that at the moment the value investors who've made decent returns should be locking those in. I think that trend can continue to run for some period of time. Although, to be fair, growth stocks over the last 10, 15 years have been so good for investors in terms of delivering performance. You don't necessarily just get rid of all your tech stocks either.
How about the situation in Asia? How do the fundamentals look for you in terms of potential earnings?
Well, Asia is sort of an interesting space right now in the sense that if we think about China's monetary policy stance, it's more neutral. So if investors are looking for clear, unambiguous policy stimulus, Asia is not really in that camp right now. It's more the United States, it's more Europe, and I think that's part of the headwinds that we might be facing for Asian markets.
We're going to have this Coinbase listing happening very soon, and one of the things it's serving to do is to boost the price of Bitcoin in and of itself. We're at 63,300 right now. In a diversified portfolio, do you want to be exposed to the crypto space?
Long story short, basically, the answer is no. There's just not enough cause yet to sort of really see correlations and so on to really build a robust portfolio around that. But that, of course, may change going forward. Maybe I'm just a little bit too old school.
Yeah, the Bitcoin story has certainly won over some of the previous skeptics. What would you need to see to convert you into a believer?
Very, very difficult question. Honestly, I'm probably going to stick to my guns on that and stick with fiat money for a very long period of time.
Fiat
right,
money.
well,
what a concept.
Off you go, Doug.
Well, we were talking a little bit about the dollar and its behavior recently being tied to yields. I'm thinking about the yen here at 109. I mean, what's your outlook for the Japanese currency very quickly?
Yeah, there we also see on a 12-month horizon yen strength just because we expect the dollar to weaken. Not that there's anything sort of fundamentally driving that. It's more of a dollar story as opposed to the yen side.
All right, Stefan Hofer, Asia Chief Investment Strategist at NYLGT Bank. Thanks so much for joining us today on Bloomberg Daybreak Asia. And we will be talking a little more about the Coinbase and Bitcoin story. We're going to be joined by Bloomberg's Mike McGlone. He's a commodity strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence. So do stay with us for that conversation. This is Bloomberg.
If knowledge is power, the Bloomberg Terminal is your power up. Connecting you to real-time financial data, market-moving news, powerful analytics, and an influential network of financial decision makers around the world. Share ideas, negotiate trades, and gain the insight you need to make more informed decisions. See how the terminal can take your workflow to the next level at Bloomberg.com/professional.
With the Bloomberg Small Business Report, I'm John Tucker. For your small business needs, call a Dell Technologies advisor today at 877-ASK-DELL. Optimism among small business owners continues to improve. The National Federation of Independent Business Monthly Optimism Index topped 98 in March. That's the highest reading since November. But the survey sub-indexes also reveal employers struggling to find qualified workers. NFIB Chief Economist Bill Dunkelberg said small business owners are competing with the pandemic aid and increased unemployment benefits that are keeping some workers out of the labor force. While Main Street is doing better as state and local restrictions are eased, he adds finding qualified labor is a critical issue for small businesses nationwide. The NFIB survey shows small employers with jobs are not able to fill rising to 42%. And that's the Bloomberg Small Business Report. I'm John Tucker.
Imagine being denied an apartment because of your religion, or your race, or because you have children, or a disability.
It's so wrong.
Yes, but who has the power to stop this?
You do. Each of us has the power. The law is on your side. It's illegal for landlords to discriminate because of race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, or familial status. If you suspect that you have experienced housing discrimination, file a complaint with HUD immediately so we can investigate it. Fair housing is your right.
Use it.
To learn more, visit hud.gov/fairhousing. That's hud.gov/fairhousing. Or call 1-800-669-9777. 1-800-669-9777. A public service message from HUD in partnership with the National Fair Housing Alliance.
How are financial services firms managing in this new reality? Claire Santaniello, Managing Director at BNY Mellon's Pershing, explains.
If the current times have taught us anything, it's the critical role that technology plays in client relationships. Global conditions have created a business imperative for firms to digitally transform the way they meet client needs and the way they work. Pershing's industry-leading technology enables you to adapt to the evolving ways your clients want to do business, now and in the future, and can help you build an even stronger digital client experience in a simpler, smarter, and safer environment. We have worked with clients of every size to transform their business. Pershing gives you the foundation to stand on, plus our unique perspective, to help you run your business even during the most uncertain of times. We help you consider everything.
To learn more about how Pershing can help you transform your business, visit Pershing.com. Pershing LLC, member FINRA, NYSE, SIPC.
The lifeblood of tech startups isn't just money. It's executive and technical skills. The kind of skills that companies need to build real products. And the skills that venture capitalist Chris Sugden of Edison Partners sees in the graduates that are coming out of New Jersey Institute of Technology.
The amazing thing about NJIT is their graduates, they have multiple offers on average, not just one. They're coming out with real skill sets that are immediately hireable and available to them. I think we see an understanding by the faculty and administration at NJIT that we've got to train and educate the whole student, not just their, one side of their brain. And I do think that's sort of part of the DNA today. There's practical and there's sort of academia, and merging those two together and understanding that if we're going to have our young people go get great jobs and have great successful careers, they've got to have both sides of their brain activated. And I think we see that with NJIT.
NJIT, New Jersey Institute of Technology. Learn more at njit.edu.
There are a lot of ways to look at the world right now.
Interesting that you've got an overweight on Hong Kong.
And the more of them you can access, the better.
What has to be his strategy?
Perspective.
Who's doing school best?
Clarity.
How do we get it so that the benefits get to everybody?
Expertise.
He seems to have exactly the right combination. It's character plus policy.
Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Business app, and BloombergRadio.com. Bloomberg, the world is listening.